The night sky over West Africa is usually silent, broken only by the sound of crickets and distant drums. But on this night, it was pierced by the low rumble of a foreign aircraft. Not a passenger jet, not a humanitarian cargo plane. It was a CIA transport touching down quietly on the tarmac of Ghana. No diplomat stepped out, no statement was issued, no attempt was made to hide the mission. And in that moment, every seasoned eye in the region knew a fire had crossed the border. They were not here for peace. They were here because of Burkina Faso. A nation once dismissed as a small landlocked country had suddenly become the storm in their sky. Why? Because a young captain, Ibrahim Traoré, had dared to say the one word the empires never accept: no to exploitation, no to Israeli weapons contracts, no to American tariffs, no to being treated like just another flag pinned on someone else's map. But what the CIA and its allies discovered in the mountains north of Gawa was not a weapons lab. It was something far more dangerous to their power, a fortress of knowledge built in silence, hidden in plain sight. They called it a red alert. We call it Sankara Core. My friends, what happens when a so-called small nation builds not missiles, but truth? What happens when Africa begins to map its own resources, protect its own data, and reveal the secrets hidden in Western archives for nearly a century? This story is not just about Burkina Faso, it is about the future of sovereignty itself. And tonight I invite you to join me to listen carefully and to decide for yourself, is this the dawn of Africa's information revolution? Please share if you believe that truth can be more powerful than weapons, and subscribe if you believe that knowledge, not silence, will shape the next chapter of our world. The red alert did not begin with explosions. It began with silence, the kind of silence only intelligence agencies recognize. Reports came across encrypted channels, unusual construction in the mountains north of Gawa, Burkina Faso. A triangular grid of reinforced concrete bunkers, solar arrays, fuel reserves, and underground fiber lines running 70 meters deep. No Western contractor had logged the project. No Chinese firm had filed permits. No satellite predicted it. And yet, there it stood. To Washington, Paris, and Tel Aviv, this was unthinkable. For decades, their agencies had prided themselves on omniscience. They always knew what Africa was building long before Africans themselves did. They tracked every military outpost before the foundations were poured, every mine, before the first stone was turned, every political summit, before the invitations were sent. But somehow this slipped through. Somehow a small nation they had dismissed as insignificant had built something outside their web of satellites and spies. When a CIA transport touched down in Ghana, it was clear what the whispers had become a red alert. They feared that Burkina Faso had joined Iran's weapons program, or that China had secretly planted infrastructure under their noses. What they saw instead was stranger. The heat signatures were too diffuse for weapons. The arrays were too sophisticated for a mere storage base. Their analysts could not classify it. That uncertainty terrified them more than any missile silo. Inside Burkina Faso, the answer had a name: Sankara Core. It was not a weapons lab, but a shield of sovereignty. A live database of African resources contracts and surveillance built from African soil and African mines. For decades, the West had ruled not through open war but through hidden maps and secret knowledge. They knew where lithium veins cut through the desert before Africans did. They predicted rainfall and crop yields months in advance, adjusting commodity prices while African farmers prayed for rain. They routed African internet traffic through servers in Europe and America, siphoning data while governments remained blind. Sankara Core turned the tables. It hacked back into the very databases where Africa's stolen knowledge was stored. Geological surveys, mineral maps, internal memos from mining giants, information worth billions. Burkina Faso did not just recover its own secrets. It saw, often for the first time, the full scope of what foreign companies knew about the continent's wealth, and it began to act. The first test came with bauxite mining rights in the southeast. A Canadian firm arrived with what seemed like a fair contract: 50-50 revenue split, guaranteed jobs, and promises of environmental protection. But Sankara Core revealed the buried truth. The deposits were twice as rich as advertised. The company's private assessments showed heavy groundwater contamination hidden from local authorities. Emails revealed strategies to rewrite the terms once operations began. Armed with evidence, the government rejected the contract and published the proof for the world to see. The shock was immediate. Investors panicked, realizing their old advantage, knowing more than Africa was gone. Other African nations began demanding to see similar hidden surveys. Stock prices wavered. For the first time, the global mining industry was on the defensive, not Africa. But Sankara Core was more than geology. It reached into cables, embassies, and aid agencies. It intercepted the real reports Western diplomats sent home, reports far harsher than their smiling press conferences. It tracked which opposition movements received quiet funding, which NGOs were shells for intelligence networks, which media outlets ran on subsidies from foreign capitals. This was why the CIA came. Not because Burkina Faso had missiles, but because it had memory. Because for the first time, Africa possessed the same kind of real-time intelligence that had been used to dominate it for centuries. Because a nation once dismissed as too small to matter had shown it could build something invisible, untraceable, and devastating to the balance of power. The fire that crossed the border that night was not one of bombs, but of panic. If one small African nation could slip past the satellites, what else had the West missed? And worse, who else might follow? The red alert escalated quickly. At first, it was whispers of unusual infrastructure. Then came the drones. Sleek, high-altitude machines hovering over Burkina Faso's skies, sending back streams of encrypted images to Langley and Paris. But what they found unsettled them even more. The structures at Gawa defied their models. The data flow was vast, yet encrypted in protocols unfamiliar even to NSA cryptographers. The facility consumed power like a weapons lab, but radiated no heat signatures of missiles or centrifuges. To the Western intelligence mind, uncertainty itself was the threat. That was when Robert Van arrived, the CIA liaison, whose name was already infamous across West Africa. He had been linked to covert destabilizations, discreetly funding opposition groups, engineering what Washington called democratic transition assistance. His presence in Ghana left little doubt they were preparing regime change. He sought overflight permissions, pressed Ghanaian security for details, and quietly planned infiltration. But what he didn't know was that Burkina Faso was already watching him, reading his cables before his own superiors did. The real battle began not with troops, but with code. Western hackers probed the Sankara Core, convinced they could map its architecture. For 10 minutes, they believed they had breached it. They saw ordinary servers, modest encryption, the kind of routine system any government might run. But it was a looped simulation, a mirror designed to give intruders exactly what they expected. While the CIA studied their victory, Burkina Faso traced every line of their attack back to its origin. In that moment, the hunters became the hunted. Then came the move that sent shockwaves through every war room. The drone went dark. No missile strike, no wreckage, no evidence. Just silence. A localized electromagnetic pulse had cut it from the sky, surgical, undeniable, yet leaving no pretext for escalation. For decades, Western doctrine in Africa relied on asymmetric tools, satellites, drones, cyber warfare that bypassed the need for mass troops. But here was a nation demonstrating it could blind them, confuse them, and strike back without firing a bullet. Washington panicked, Paris scrambled, Tel Aviv convened emergency calls. Within hours, the headlines began to appear. Burkina Faso destabilizing regional peace, possible Iranian influence, Traore erratic and unpredictable. CNN ran soft probes, French outlets spoke of hidden military facilities, and Israeli officials warned of African rogue intelligence. It was the same playbook used against Iraq, Libya, and countless others: accuse, isolate, and prepare the stage for intervention. But this time, the script cracked, because Burkina Faso did not simply deny, it revealed. Using Sankara Core, the government exposed a Canadian mining company's lies, publishing hidden surveys that showed richer deposits and concealed environmental risks. Contracts once thought fair were unmasked as traps. Other African nations, long suspicious of their own deals, began demanding the same documents. The scandal rattled markets, and for the first time corporations feared Africa's knowledge more than Africa's poverty. Then came the most devastating revelation, the Perpetual Extraction Zone document dated 1937. Buried in French corporate archives, later merged with Israeli firms, it declared Burkina Faso's minerals pledged as collateral for European debt long before independence. In one stroke, Traore's government proved that sovereignty had been a carefully maintained illusion for decades. The text was translated into 11 languages, released for all to see. Overnight whispers turned to outrage. If Burkina Faso had been leased like a warehouse, what about Mali, Niger, Chad? The reaction was seismic. Saudi Arabia declared that any violation of Burkina Faso's sovereignty would be treated as provocation. Pakistan offered satellite coverage to replace Western overflight. Mali pledged troops at the border not to invade, but to defend. Even in Ghana, where the CIA had staged its entry, quiet officials began to question whether they too had been written into someone else's ledger of extraction. The climax was no longer just about drones or bunkers. It was about truth. The moment Sankara Core proved that Western intelligence could be outsmarted and Western contracts unmasked, a fire spread across the continent. Leaders saw a weapon more powerful than guns documentation, citizens saw a shield more powerful than walls knowledge. And the empires that once mapped every inch of Africa now feared what they could no longer see. The shockwaves of Sankara Core did not stop at Gawa's mountains. They rippled outward, touching the daily lives of ordinary citizens and reshaping the political map of an entire continent. For decades, Africans had suspected they were being cheated. They heard rumors of hidden surveys, of contracts signed in secrecy, of debts that never seemed to end. But suspicion is not the same as proof. Proof changes everything. The release of the Perpetual Extraction Zone document was more than a historical scandal. It was a civic awakening. People filled the streets of Ouagadougou, holding copies of the translated files, reading them aloud in markets and schools. Since 1937, our future was collateral. One elderly man told a reporter, his voice trembling with both rage and vindication. For the first time, the invisible chains of colonial economics were visible to all. Communities across Burkina Faso began to mobilize. Student unions held seminars on resource contracts. Farmers' cooperatives demanded access to agricultural data once hoarded by foreign banks. Local newspapers, armed with decrypted surveys, published exposés that rivaled anything from international media. The line between citizen and intelligence agent blurred. The people themselves became guardians of sovereignty. The government reinforced this new vigilance with a radical innovation: civilian alert systems. Unlike traditional early warning systems designed for missiles, these alerts monitored the subtle fingerprints of regime change. Citizens could report sudden NGO funding spikes, unusual embassy activity, or suspicious foreign contractors. In markets, in mosques, even in soccer stadiums, ordinary Burkinabe carried the weight of national defense. For the first time, the population felt not just ruled, but enlisted. Politically, the effect was explosive. Across Africa, governments that had quietly tolerated unequal contracts now faced emboldened citizens demanding transparency. Nigeria asked to digitize its colonial archives. Chad requested technical assistance to secure its mining sector. Even Ghana, despite hosting CIA operations, began discreet inquiries about accessing their own buried documents. Sankara Core had transformed from a national project into a continental template. Internationally, the revelations destabilized the legitimacy of Western institutions. When Burkina Faso showcased internal World Bank documents delivered by Dr. Amina Kone, a Senegalese economist who defected from Washington, the picture grew darker still. These papers revealed not only economic exploitation, but psychological manipulation. Detailed profiles of African leaders, notes on their weaknesses, and strategies for pressure were exposed to the world. It was not just economics, it was a system of control that reached into the private lives of those in power. With this knowledge, several African governments began quietly renegotiating their debts. Within weeks, 3 nations had restructured loans that once seemed inescapable. Others reopened mining contracts, this time armed with geological evidence hidden in foreign vaults. The domino effect was undeniable. The balance of negotiation had shifted. For the Burkinabe people, the change was more than financial. It was emotional. For once, said a young woman in Bobo Dioulasso, we are not begging for freedom. We are documenting it. Churches preached sermons about dignity reclaimed. Artists painted murals of Sankara Core as a glowing sun rising over the Sahel. The sense of betrayal was deep, but so was the pride. Yet these victories also brought peril. Western media doubled down on portraying Burkina Faso as authoritarian, erratic, unstable. Aid agencies threatened suspensions. Sanctions were whispered in Brussels. But the usual tactics of isolation failed to take hold. Why? Because now the truth traveled faster than propaganda. Citizens across Africa and even allies in Asia and Latin America saw the documents with their own eyes. The civil society awakening and the political aftershocks revealed a stark reality. This was not just a clash between states. It was a collision between two worldviews. One believed sovereignty was granted by treaties written in foreign capitals. The other insisted sovereignty was reclaimed when ordinary people understood the truth. In that collision, Burkina Faso had lit a torch and the flame was spreading. In Washington, the discovery of Sankara Core triggered something rare: fear wrapped in confusion. For decades, U.S. policymakers had believed Africa's greatest weakness was transparency. Too many holes in governments, too many leaks in institutions. Yet here was a nation not only sealing its own vulnerabilities, but turning the lens back on them. If they can build this, one former CIA analyst admitted off record, what else have we missed? The immediate response was familiar containment. Think tanks rushed to publish reports branding President Ibrahim Traoré authoritarian. Editorial boards warned of foreign influence, hinting at Iranian or Russian fingerprints. Aid programs quietly suspended funding, while congressional hearings framed Burkina Faso as a strategic risk to U.S. interests. But behind closed doors, the anxiety was sharper. If Burkina Faso's data revolution spread, the U.S. could lose one of its most subtle weapons: informational dominance. Across the Atlantic, Europe faced a similar reckoning. French media doubled down on the narrative of instability, but French corporations watched stock prices wobble as African governments questioned mining contracts once thought secure. Brussels whispered about sanctions, yet officials admitted privately that punishment might drive more nations toward the very alliances Europe feared: Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Russia, and even China. In Israel, the reaction was more aggressive. Prime Minister Netanyahu convened the UN Security Council demanding sanctions and painting Burkina Faso as a hub of anti-Western intelligence. Yet his tone revealed unease. The exposure of extraction deals involving Israeli-linked firms risked tarnishing Israel's global reputation, especially among countries in the global south whose diplomatic support Israel increasingly needed. But not every reaction was hostile. In Riyadh, officials celebrated openly. Any attack on Burkina Faso will be treated as provocation. Saudi media declared, signaling for the first time that a Middle Eastern giant was extending security guarantees to sub-Saharan Africa. In Islamabad, Pakistan's defense ministry offered satellite coverage and secure communications, proving that alliances outside Western control were not only symbolic, they were functional. And beyond Africa, ripples spread further. In Latin America, indigenous leaders requested access to Burkina Faso's methods for monitoring resource extraction. In Southeast Asia, environmental activists studied Sankara Core as a blueprint for resisting illegal logging and mining. Even some Western civil society groups quietly applauded. If they can check corporate abuse in Africa, one European activist said, maybe we can do it here too. For the United States, the dilemma grew sharper. Officially, Burkina Faso was framed as a small, erratic regime punching above its weight. Unofficially, policymakers knew it was something larger: the test case of whether the post-World War II order built on institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and US-controlled information channels could survive a world where data no longer flowed in one direction. For everyday Americans, especially older generations who lived through the Cold War, the echoes were haunting. Then, too, a small nation could disrupt global balances. Then, too, intelligence failures shook Washington's confidence. The difference now is that the battlefield is not nuclear missiles or proxy wars, it is information. A war of archives, contracts, servers, and code, and that is what makes the case of Burkina Faso so unsettling to the West. Because missiles can be intercepted and rebels can be crushed. But once the truth is revealed, once documents are copied and shared across borders, there is no going back. The empire of secrecy is crumbling, and for the first time, Africa, not America, decides the pace. The story of Sankara Core is not about weapons or armies. It is about the quiet power of truth. For centuries, Africa was mapped by others, defined by others, and profited from by others. But now, a small nation has shown that maps can be redrawn, archives can be opened, and silence can be broken. Burkina Faso's message is simple, yet radical sovereignty is not begged for, it is built. Not with tanks or bombs, but with knowledge, with vigilance, and with courage. That is why Washington panicked. That is why Paris scrambled. Because for the first time, the same tools once used to control Africa data contract satellites are now being used by Africans themselves. But this victory comes with a warning. Information wars do not end with one revelation. They escalate. Western powers will adapt, deploying sharper narratives, more sophisticated cyber tools, and subtler forms of pressure. The question is whether Africa's awakening can keep pace and whether allies across the world will stand beside it when the pressure mounts. And here is where you, my friends, must decide. If you lived through the Cold War, if you remember how small nations once tipped the balance of history, then you know how dangerous it is to underestimate what seems insignificant. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's information revolution is truly strong enough to protect Africa's sovereignty? Or will it face the same fate as past revolutions, isolated, cornered, and undone? Please share this video if you believe truth is more powerful than weapons. Subscribe if you believe knowledge, not silence, will define the next chapter of our world. Because this dawn is not a metaphor, it is happening right now, and no red alert will stop it.